The cellar smelled like damp stone, and old wine turned sour. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan sat on the dirt floor with her back against the wall, wrists bound with rope that had gone slack from the moisture. Two German officers stood near the stairs, speaking in low voices, cigarette smoke curling toward the single bulb swinging overhead. One was tall, gray-haired, his uniform pressed despite the mud outside. The other was younger, nervous, his hand resting on his sidearm. They thought she was just another American nurse, captured during the retreat near Bastogne. Nothing special, no threat. She kept her eyes down, breathing slow and steady, letting them believe she understood nothing, but every word they spoke landed like a stone in her chest. They were discussing the upcoming counteroffensive, troop movements, timing, which roads were still passable through the snow. The younger one mentioned coordinates. The older one corrected him, pulled out a folded map. Sarah's fingers tightened against the rope. She had to stay invisible. She had to remember every single word. Now, what I'm about to tell you today, well, it's the kind of story that reminds us why we never underestimate the quiet ones. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe, because these wartime memories deserve to be heard, and there are more stories like this one that need telling. 3 days earlier, Lieutenant Sarah Brennan had been working a forward aid station just outside Bastogne. The snow had started falling thick that morning, covering the blood-soaked bandages they'd buried behind the tent. She'd been a field nurse for 18 months, moving with the 101st Airborne wherever the wounded landed. The other nurses knew her as calm, efficient, soft-spoken. She never raised her voice. She never complained about the cold or the shelling or the boys who died on her table before she could stop the bleeding. The aid station had been a farmhouse once. Now it was sandbags and canvas, a potbelly stove that barely worked, and cots laid so close together you had to step carefully in the dark. Sarah had just finished changing dressings on a sergeant with shrapnel in his shoulder when the shelling started. Not the distant kind. Close. The kind that made the ground jump and the lantern swing. Captain Morris, the surgeon, looked up from the morphine supply and said one word. Go. They moved fast. 2 ambulances, 6 nurses, a medic named Kowalski who couldn't have been older than 19. The roads were frozen mud and snow, barely wide enough for the vehicles. Sarah sat in the back of the second ambulance, holding a tin of medical supplies on her lap, watching the trees pass in the gray light. She could hear the distant thump of artillery. Somewhere ahead, the convoy had split. Someone made the wrong turn. By the time they realized it, they were alone on a farm road with no markers and no radio contact. The ambush came at a crossroads. Rifle fire from the tree line, sharp and sudden. The driver slumped forward, and the ambulance lurched into a ditch. Sarah hit the floor, supplies spilling around her. She could hear Kowalski shouting, then nothing. When the firing stopped, there were voices in German. Boots in the snow, hands pulling her out of the wreck. She kept her face blank, her hands open. One of the soldiers said something she didn't react to. He said it again, louder. She just stared at him. They walked her and Kowalski to a farmhouse a half-mile down the road. It was old, stone walls, shutters hanging crooked. Inside, it smelled like cabbage and wood smoke. A German lieutenant stood by the fireplace warming his hands. He looked at Sarah with tired eyes, asked her something in German. She shook her head. He switched to broken English. You are nurse, yes? She nodded. He gestured to a chair. She sat. Kowalski stood near the door, pale, his hands shaking. The German lieutenant's name was Richter. He was older, maybe 50, with lines around his mouth that looked like they'd been carved by something heavier than age. He didn't seem interested in interrogation. He asked if they needed water. He told a soldier to bring bread. Sarah watched him carefully, saying nothing, understanding everything. Richter spoke to his men in quick, clipped German, instructions about the road, about moving before dark, about the American positions they'd need to avoid. Sarah kept her face empty. That night, they moved her to the cellar. Kowalski stayed upstairs, guarded by 2 young soldiers who looked as cold and tired as anyone. The cellar was small, dirt floor, stone walls that wept moisture. There was a single cot, a blanket that smelled like mildew, and a bucket in the corner. Sarah sat on the cot and waited. She could hear boots on the floor above, voices muffled through the wood. She closed her eyes and steadied her breathing. She'd been trained for this. Not officially, not in any manual, but trained nonetheless. Her father had been a language professor at Columbia before the war, German literature mostly. Sarah had grown up hearing Goethe and Heine read aloud at the dinner table, her father's voice turning the words into music. She'd studied it in school, then again in college. By the time she enlisted, she could read German newspapers, understand radio broadcasts, follow conversations in Berlin dialect or Bavarian drawl, but she'd never told anyone in the army. It hadn't seemed important. She was a nurse. Languages didn't matter when you were stopping blood. Now it mattered. Upstairs, Richter was talking to another officer, their voices low but clear through the floorboards. They were discussing troop movements. Reinforcements expected near St. Vith, a supply line that had been cut, roads that were still passable if they moved at night. Sarah lay on the cot, eyes closed, listening to every word. She repeated the details silently, locking them into memory. Unit numbers, map coordinates, times. She didn't move, she barely breathed. The next morning they brought her upstairs. Richter was sitting at a table drinking ersatz coffee from a chipped mug. He gestured for her to sit. A young corporal stood by the window, rifle slung over his shoulder. Richter asked her in English how she was feeling. She said fine. He asked if she needed medical supplies for Kowalski, who had a cut on his hand. She said yes. He told the corporal to bring the aid kit from the ambulance. Then he turned back to his paperwork, speaking in German to the corporal about checkpoints and patrol schedules. Sarah kept her expression neutral. She nodded when Richter looked at her. She cleaned Kowalski's hand with iodine, wrapped it with gauze, said nothing. The corporal watched her with suspicion, but Richter seemed satisfied. He was a professional, she realized, tired of the war, but still doing his duty. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't interested in games. He just wanted to move his men safely through enemy territory and avoid unnecessary death. That made him predictable. That made him useful. On the second day, a new officer arrived. Sturmbannführer Krause, SS. Younger, maybe 35, with pale eyes and a mouth that never smiled. He came into the farmhouse like he owned it, brushing snow off his coat, barely acknowledging Richter's salute. Sarah was sitting in the corner, hands folded, when Krause walked past her. He stopped, looked down, said something in German, sharp and dismissive. Richter answered carefully. Krause laughed, a cold sound. Then he looked at Sarah again and switched to English. You understand nothing, yes? She met his eyes and shook her head. Krause didn't believe her. She could see it in the way he watched her, the way he spoke German around her with deliberate clarity, testing. That night when they moved her back to the cellar, he followed, stood at the top of the stairs smoking a cigarette, speaking to Richter in low tones. They were arguing. Richter wanted to move the prisoners west, hand them over to a POW transport. Krause wanted to stay, use the farmhouse as a base for forward reconnaissance. He mentioned an operation, a push toward Bastogne, timing that depended on American positions remaining confused. Sarah lay on the cot, listening. Krause's voice was colder than Richter's, more certain. He talked about eliminating resistance pockets, about acceptable casualties, about moving fast before reinforcements arrived. He mentioned a supply depot the Americans had abandoned near Foy. He said it would be hit within 36 hours. Then he stopped talking. Footsteps on the stairs. Sarah kept her eyes closed, her breathing even. Krause stood in the doorway for a long moment. She could feel him watching. Then he turned and went back upstairs. The door closed. The bolt slid into place, and Sarah Brennan opened her eyes in the dark, her mind already working through everything she'd just heard. The third morning came with heavy fog. Sarah woke to the sound of trucks outside, engines idling, men shouting orders in the cold. She sat up on the cot, listening, boots on the stairs, the bolt sliding back. A young private opened the door, gestured for her to come up. His face was red from the cold, his breath visible in the dim light. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs stiff from the damp cellar. Upstairs, the farmhouse was busier than before. Soldiers moving equipment, a radio operator hunched over his set in the corner, static crackling through the speaker. Richter stood by the window, studying a map spread across the table. Krause was beside him, pointing to something with a gloved finger. They were speaking quickly, urgently. Sarah caught fragments, road conditions, American patrols, a bridge that had been damaged by shelling. Kraus wanted to move south. Richter was arguing for waiting until the fog cleared. Kraus's voice rose, sharp and impatient. He said something about time running out, about orders from command. Richter's jaw tightened, but he nodded. They put Sarah and Kowalski in the back of a covered truck. 2 guards sat across from them, rifles across their knees. The truck lurched forward, tires slipping on ice before catching. Through the canvas flap, Sarah could see the fog pressing close, turning the forest into gray shadows. Kowalski was shaking, not from cold, from fear. He leaned close and whispered, "What do you think they're gonna do with us?" Sarah looked at him steadily. "Nothing," she said. "We're more useful alive." She didn't mention what she'd heard. She couldn't. Not yet. The truck stopped after 20 minutes. Voices outside. Then the canvas pulled back. They were at another farmhouse, larger, with a barn behind it and a stone well in the yard. Kraus stepped out of a staff car, his coat dusted with snow. He barked orders at the guards, then walked into the house without looking back. Sarah and Kowalski were led to the barn. Inside, it smelled like hay and old leather. There were 2 other prisoners, American soldiers, both wounded, both silent. One had a bandage around his head, dark with dried blood. Sarah knelt beside him, checked the bandage. It needed changing. She asked the guard for medical supplies. He stared at her, uncomprehending. She repeated it in gestures, pointing to the wound, miming wrapping. He hesitated, then left. Came back 10 minutes later with a small aid kit. She worked carefully, cleaning the wound, applying fresh gauze. The soldier watched her with hollow eyes. "Thanks, ma'am," he whispered. She nodded. Behind her, Kowalski was sitting with his back against the wall, his head in his hands. That afternoon, Kraus came to the barn. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray light, and spoke to the guards in clipped German. Then he looked at Sarah. "You," he said in English. "Come." She stood slowly, brushed straw from her uniform, followed him across the yard to the farmhouse. Inside it was warmer. A fire burned in the hearth. Maps covered the table. Richter was there, along with 2 other officers she didn't recognize. Kraus gestured to a chair. Sarah sat. Kraus walked around the table, hands clasped behind his back. He spoke in German, his tone conversational, almost friendly. He was talking about the war, about how difficult it was for everyone, about how prisoners were a burden no one wanted. He mentioned the Geneva Convention. He mentioned pragmatism. He said the Americans were retreating, that the situation was shifting, that cooperation might make things easier. Then he stopped in front of Sarah and switched to English. "You are educated woman, yes? University?" She nodded carefully. "And you understand only English?" She nodded again. Kraus smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. He turned to Richter and said something in rapid German. Too fast, too colloquial for someone with basic language skills to follow. He was talking about a supply convoy, about coordinates, about timing. He used military jargon, unit designations. Sarah kept her face blank, her hands folded in her lap. Kraus watched her the entire time. When he finished, he leaned down close to her face. "You understand nothing," he said in German. It wasn't a question. Sarah met his eyes and said nothing. Richter interrupted. He spoke quietly, but firmly. He told Kraus that interrogating medical personnel was pointless, that they were protected under international law, that there were better uses of time. Kraus straightened, his expression darkening. He said something sharp, dismissive. Richter's face remained impassive, but Sarah saw his hands tighten on the edge of the table. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Finally, Kraus waved his hand, a curt gesture. The guard took Sarah back to the barn. That night, Sarah lay awake on the cold dirt floor, staring at the barn's rafters. She'd heard enough. The supply depot at Foy would be hit at dawn. 2 days from now, maybe less. There was a patrol route the Germans believed was unguarded, a bridge they planned to use for vehicle movement. She had the coordinates, the timing, the unit strength, information that could save dozens of American lives, maybe more, but she was locked in a barn behind enemy lines with no radio, no weapons, no way to communicate. She closed her eyes and forced herself to think clearly. Kowalski was asleep, his breathing ragged. The two wounded soldiers were quiet, one of them feverish, mumbling in his sleep. Sarah sat up slowly, moved to the barn door. It was barred from outside, heavy wood reinforced with iron. The walls were stone at the base, wood planks above. She ran her hands along the planks, testing. Most were solid, but near the back, close to the floor, one was loose. She worked at it carefully, quietly, her fingers numb from the cold. It took 20 minutes, but it came free. Behind it, a gap barely wide enough for a body. She looked back at Kowalski. He was awake now, watching her. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Sarah hesitated. Then she told him the truth. Not all of it. Just enough. She said she had information that needed to get back to American lines. She said she was going to try. Kowalski stared at her. "You're insane," he said. "They'll shoot you." Sarah nodded. "Probably." She pulled off her coat, handed it to him. "Give this to the wounded one. He needs it more than me." Kowalski didn't take it. "Lieutenant," she pressed it into his hands. "If I don't come back, tell them what I told you. Tell them about Foy." She slipped through the gap into the cold night. The snow was falling again, light and steady. She could see the farmhouse 50 yards away, yellow light in the windows. Voices inside, faint. She moved low, keeping to the shadows, heading toward the tree line. Her boots crunched in the snow. Too loud. She stopped, listened. Nothing. Moved again. Made it to the trees. Turned and looked back. The barn was dark, the farmhouse glowing like a lantern. She took a breath, then started walking northeast toward where she hoped American lines might be. She walked for an hour, maybe more. The cold was brutal, cutting through her uniform, numbing her fingers and face. She had no compass, no map, just the stars, barely visible through the clouds, and a sense of direction she wasn't sure she could trust. The forest was dense, the snow deeper where it had drifted. She stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. Her teeth were chattering so hard she thought they might crack. She thought about stopping, finding shelter, waiting for daylight. But daylight meant patrols. Daylight meant being seen. She heard the voices before she saw them. German. Close. She dropped flat, pressing herself into the snow behind a fallen log. Two soldiers walking patrol, their rifles slung casually. They were talking about the cold, about wanting coffee, about how much longer until their shift ended. They passed within 10 feet of her. She didn't breathe, didn't move. One of them stopped, lit a cigarette. The match flared bright. Sarah closed her eyes, willing herself invisible. After a moment, they moved on, their voices fading into the trees. She waited 5 minutes, then stood. Her legs were shaking. She couldn't feel her hands anymore. She had to keep moving or she'd freeze. She pushed forward, deeper into the forest, trying to angle away from the patrol route. The snow was falling harder now, erasing her tracks almost as fast as she made them. That was good. That meant they couldn't follow, but it also meant she couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. She could walk in circles and never know it. Then she heard the engine. Distant, mechanical American, a jeep maybe. She changed direction, moving toward the sound. It grew louder, then stopped. Voices, but in English this time. She wanted to shout, to run, but caution held her back. She crept forward, peering through the trees. A checkpoint. 2 GIs standing beside a jeep, smoking, their rifles leaning against the hood. She stepped out slowly, hands raised. One of them saw her, shouted, swung his rifle up. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice hoarse. "Don't shoot, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, U.S. Army Nurse Corps." They didn't lower their rifles. "Prove it," one of them said. Sarah reached slowly for her collar, pulled out her dog tags. The soldier stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. He read the tags, looked at her face, then at his partner. "Get the captain," he said quietly. The other soldier ran. Sarah stood there, swaying, her body finally registering the cold, the exhaustion, the fear she'd been holding back. The soldier, watching her, lowered his rifle slightly. "You look half frozen, ma'am," he said. She nodded. "I have information," she said, "about an attack. It's urgent." 10 minutes later, she was sitting in a tent with a cup of hot coffee in her hands, her body wrapped in a wool blanket. A captain sat across from her, a notepad open on his knee. Behind him, a major stood with arms crossed, listening. Sarah talked. She told them everything. The farmhouse, the barn, Kraus and Richter, the conversations she'd overheard, the supply depot at Foy, the timing, the coordinates, the patrol routes. She spoke clearly, precisely, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands. When she finished, the major looked at the captain. "Get this to regiment," he said quietly. "Now." Then he looked at Sarah. "Where'd you learn German, Lieutenant?" Sarah looked at the major, her hand still wrapped around the coffee cup. "My father taught German literature at Columbia," she said quietly. "I grew up speaking it." The major's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition. Understanding. He glanced at the captain, then back at Sarah. "And you never thought to mention this when you enlisted?" Sarah met his gaze. "I was a nurse," she said. "I didn't think it mattered." The major was silent for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "It matters now." They kept her at the command post for 2 hours, asking questions, confirming details, cross-referencing her information with intelligence reports they'd already received. Every piece fit. The unit designations matched. The coordinates aligned with suspected German positions. The timeline made sense with observed enemy movements. A colonel arrived, older, with tired eyes and mud on his boots. He listened to Sarah repeat her story, then looked at the major. "This is solid," he said. "We need to move on it." The major agreed. Sarah sat there, wrapped in the blanket, watching them plan. By dawn, they'd repositioned 2 companies to intercept the German advance on Foy. Artillery was redirected. Patrols were rerouted. The supply depot was reinforced with a full platoon and 2 anti-tank guns. Sarah watched the organized chaos from inside the tent, medics and officers moving past, radios crackling with coded messages. A sergeant brought her dry socks and a clean uniform. She changed slowly, her body still shaking from the cold. When she came out, the major was waiting. "We're sending a patrol back to get your people," he said. "The other prisoners." The patrol left at first light. 8 men moving fast and quiet through the snow. Sarah wanted to go with them, but the major refused. "You've done enough," he said. She sat in the tent drinking more coffee, listening to distant artillery. The sound was different now, purposeful, controlled. American guns hitting German positions before they could advance. She thought about Kowalski, about the 2 wounded soldiers in the barn. She thought about Richter, about whether he'd realize what had happened, about whether he'd survive the day. The patrol came back 3 hours later. Kowalski was with them, pale but alive. So were the 2 wounded soldiers, carried on stretchers. Kowalski saw Sarah and his face crumpled. He walked straight to her, stopped a few feet away. "You made it," he said, his voice thick. Sarah nodded. "So did you." Kowalski looked down at his hands. "They came for us right after you left," he said. "Kraus, he was furious. He knew someone got out. He wanted to shoot us right there." Sarah's chest tightened. "But Richter stopped him?" Kowalski shook his head. "Richter tried, but Kraus didn't listen. He put a gun to my head." He looked up at Sarah, his eyes haunted. Then the shelling started. American artillery. Right on top of their positions, everything went to hell. The guards ran. Richter pulled us into the cellar, told us to stay down. When it was over, he left the cellar door unlocked. Just walked away. Sarah closed her eyes. Richter had understood. Somehow he'd known. And he'd let them go anyway. The reports came in throughout the day. The German advance on Foy had been stopped before it started. Casualties were heavy on their side, minimal on the American side. The supply depot was intact. 2 enemy officers had been captured during the engagement. One of them was Kraus. Sarah heard that news from the captain, who delivered it with a grim satisfaction. "He's asking to speak with command," the captain said. "Says he has information to trade." Sarah said nothing. She wondered if Kraus had realized yet. Probably not. That evening, the colonel called her to his tent. He was sitting behind a field desk, a kerosene lamp throwing shadows on the canvas walls. He gestured for her to sit. "I've been reading your file, Lieutenant," he said. "You graduated top of your class in nursing school, volunteered for field service. 18 months in combat zones without a single complaint or incident." He paused. "But there's nothing in here about language skills." Sarah waited. The colonel leaned back. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Sarah thought about how to answer. Finally, she said, "Because I wanted to help. I wanted to save lives. I didn't want to sit in some office translating documents." The colonel nodded slowly. "I understand that. But you realize what you could have been doing this whole time? The intelligence you could have provided?" Sarah looked at him steadily. "I provided intelligence when it mattered," she said quietly. The colonel smiled, just slightly. "Yes, you did." He opened a folder, pulled out a paper. "I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star, and I'm also recommending you for a transfer." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Transfer?" The colonel nodded. "To intelligence services. Your skills are too valuable to waste in a field hospital, Lieutenant. You've proven that." Sarah shook her head. "Sir, with respect, I'm a nurse. That's what I do. That's what I'm good at." The colonel set the paper down. "You're good at a lot of things, apparently. But this isn't a request. It's coming from division. You'll be reassigned within the week." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. She'd spent 18 months learning to save people. Now they wanted her to do something else. She left the tent and walked out into the snow. It was falling again, soft and steady, covering the mud and blood and tire tracks. She stood there for a long time, her breath visible in the cold air. Kowalski found her eventually. He didn't say anything, just stood beside her, hands in his pockets. After a while, he spoke. "They're transferring you, aren't they?" Sarah nodded. Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "You saved a lot of lives, Lieutenant," he said. "More than you would have in the hospital." Sarah looked at him. "Maybe," she said. "But I didn't become a nurse to be a spy." The transfer orders came 2 days later. Sarah packed her kit, said goodbye to the medics and nurses she'd worked with, and climbed into a jeep heading west. She looked back once at the aid station, at the tents and the ambulances and the soldiers being carried in on stretchers. That was her place. That was where she belonged. But the war didn't care what she wanted. It never had. The jeep pulled away, and Sarah turned to face forward, watching the road disappear into the snow. She spent the next 4 months working intelligence, translating intercepted communications, interrogating prisoners, sitting in cold rooms with German officers who looked at her with a mixture of confusion and resentment. She was good at it, better than she wanted to be. The information she extracted helped plan operations, saved American lives, shortened the war by days or weeks or maybe just hours. But every night she went to sleep thinking about the aid station, about the soldiers she wasn't treating, about the wounds she wasn't cleaning. In March, the war shifted. The Allies were pushing deeper into Germany. Resistance was collapsing. Sarah was in a command tent outside Remagen when a report came in about a captured German officer, Sturmbannführer Krause. He'd been in an American POW camp since December, and now he was being transferred for further interrogation. The officer handling the case wanted someone who spoke fluent German, someone who could get past his defenses. Sarah's name came up. She walked into the interrogation room with a folder under her arm, and her heart beating too fast. Krause was sitting at a table, his uniform dirty and torn, his face thinner than she remembered. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, he didn't recognize her. Then his eyes widened, his mouth opened. "You," he said in German. Sarah set the folder on the table and sat down. "Me," she said in the same language. Krause stared at her, his face going pale. "You understood. The entire time. Everything." Sarah nodded. "Yes." Krause leaned back slowly, his hands flat on the table. "I should have known," he said quietly. "The way you sat, the way you listened. But I thought—" He stopped. Sarah waited. Krause looked at her with something between anger and exhaustion. "What are you?" he asked. Sarah opened the folder, pulled out a page of notes. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Brennan," she said calmly. "U.S. Army Nurse Corps. And you're going to tell me everything you know about remaining SS positions in the Ruhr Valley." The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Krause talked, not because he wanted to, but because he understood finally that he'd lost, that the woman he'd underestimated, the quiet nurse he'd dismissed, had been the reason his operation failed, had been the reason dozens of his men were dead or captured, had been the reason the war was ending the way it was. When it was over, Sarah closed the folder and stood. Krause looked up at her. "If I had known," he started. Sarah cut him off. "It wouldn't have mattered," she said. and she walked out. The war in Europe ended 6 weeks later. Sarah was still in Germany, still working intelligence, still doing a job she'd never wanted. But when the celebration started, when the soldiers were drinking and singing and crying with relief, she found herself standing alone outside a field hospital, watching medics carry the last of the wounded inside. A nurse came out, saw her standing there, walked over. "You used to be a nurse, didn't you?" she asked. Sarah nodded. The nurse smiled tiredly. "We could use the help if you're free." Sarah looked at her, then at the hospital tent, and for the first time in months she felt something settle inside her chest. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm free." You know, stories like this, they remind us that the war was won by people who did what had to be done, even when it cost them something. Sarah Brennan went back to nursing after the war ended, worked in veterans' hospitals for 30 years, never talked much about her time in intelligence. But the men she saved at Foy, the ones who came home because of what she risked, they never forgot. If this story meant something to you, if you want to make sure we keep sharing these memories before they're lost, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this, stories that deserve to be remembered.